They called her a stain on the family name the day they cast her out. And when she returned 3 years later, the knight who had never spoken a word to anyone looked at her face and whispered a name that had been dead for 700 years. Eleanor Ashford was 17 when her stepmother declared her too plain to marry, too dull to present in society, and too much of a burden to keep under their roof. It wasn't cruelty that drove the decision, her stepmother explained with cold practicality. It was economics. Eleanor's two stepsisters were beauties, marketable, valuable. Eleanor, with her unremarkable features and quiet manner, would only diminish their prospects by association. So on a February morning in 2019, Eleanor was given a bus ticket, $300, and an address for a distant aunt in rural Vermont who had agreed, for a small fee, to take her in. The aunt's farmhouse sat at the edge of a forest that locals called the Whisperwood, though nobody could quite remember why. The old woman was kind enough but distant, absorbed in her work restoring antique textiles for museums and private collectors. Eleanor was given a room in the attic, a list of chores, and little else. She spent her days in silence, learning to cook, to garden, to lose herself in books from the aunt's vast library. She cried herself to sleep for the first month. By the second, she had stopped crying. By the sixth, she had stopped thinking about the family that discarded her. What changed her was the tapestry. Her aunt had been commissioned to restore a massive medieval piece, nearly 12 feet wide, depicting a battle scene from the Crusades. It had been discovered in the cellar of a demolished monastery in France, water-damaged and half-rotted, but still hauntingly beautiful. Eleanor became obsessed with it. She would sit for hours, studying the faces of the knights, the strange symbols woven into the borders, the figure of a woman standing apart from the battle, her hand raised as if in blessing or farewell. The woman's face was partially destroyed, but something about her posture, the tilt of her head, felt unbearably familiar. Her aunt noticed Eleanor's fascination and began teaching her the craft. Thread by thread, Eleanor learned to restore not just fabric, but history. She discovered she had a gift for it, a patience and attention to detail that bordered on supernatural. Her aunt's colleagues began to notice. Commissions came specifically requesting Eleanor's hand. She was invited to workshops in Boston, then New York, then Paris. And somewhere in those 3 years, as her hands brought dead things back to life, Eleanor herself was transformed. She didn't plan it. She didn't even notice it happening. But grief had carved her features into something striking. Solitude had given her a presence that turned heads. Knowledge had lit a fire behind her eyes that people found magnetic. By the time she was 20, Eleanor Ashford was no longer plain. She was luminous. She returned home in the autumn of 2022, not because she wanted to, but because her father had died and the will required her presence. Her stepmother answered the door and actually gasped. Her stepsisters, both now married to unremarkable men in unremarkable circumstances, stared at her with undisguised envy and confusion. Eleanor said very little. She attended the funeral, signed the papers, and prepared to leave again that same evening. But then she met him. The estate was selling off her father's collections, and among the buyers was a man named Thomas Ashcroft. He was perhaps 35, tall and gaunt, with the kind of face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile decades ago. He moved through the house like a ghost, examining artifacts with an intensity that made the auction staff uncomfortable. He bought almost nothing, just a single item. A small, tarnished silver ring with an inscription so worn it was illegible. Eleanor noticed him staring at her during the auction. Not the way men usually looked at her now, with appreciation or desire. He stared at her the way someone stares at an impossible equation, or a word on the tip of their tongue. When their eyes met, he went pale and actually staggered backward, gripping the wall for support. After the auction, he approached her in the garden, where she had escaped for air. "Forgive me," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "This will sound insane, but I have to ask, have you ever been to Acre, the city in Israel?" Eleanor shook her head, unnerved by the desperate hope in his eyes. "Have you ever dreamed of it? Stone walls, the smell of salt and blood, A fortress falling? No, she whispered. Should I have? Thomas closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. Your name. In another time, it was Eleanor. You stood on a rampart while the city burned. You told me you would find me again, that not even death could keep us apart. And then the stones fell, and I watched you die in my arms, while the Saracens breached the walls. Eleanor should have walked away, should have called for help, but there was something in his brokenness that felt like recognition. Who are you? She asked. I don't know anymore, he said. I was a scholar, medieval history. I specialized in the Crusades, specifically the fall of Acre in 1291. It was academic until 5 years ago, when the dreams started. Every night, the same life. I was a Templar knight named Thomas de Ashford, and there was a woman, a noble woman, who had followed her brother to the Holy Land, Eleanor de Valence. I loved her. We had 3 months together before the siege. And when she died, I swore an oath that I would find her again, in whatever life came next. He pulled the ring from his pocket. This was recovered from the ruins of the Templar fortress. It has her name inside, Eleanor. I've carried it for 2 years, searching. And then I saw you today, and I knew. The shape of your eyes, the way you hold your head, even your voice. It's impossible, but I know you. Eleanor's hands were shaking. She had never told anyone, but she had dreamed too. Not every night like him, but sometimes. Stone corridors, the weight of a cloak, the sound of swords, and a man's voice promising her forever. This is crazy, she said. I know. I should leave. Please don't. They stood in the garden as the sun set, 2 strangers bound by something neither could name or deny. Thomas told her everything, how the dreams had driven him to madness, cost him his career, his marriage, his grip on reality. How he had spent years trying to prove or disprove reincarnation, studying every case, every theory. How he had nearly ended his own life because the grief of losing her 8 centuries ago was more real than anything in his present. And Eleanor, who had learned in her 3 years of exile that the world was stranger and deeper than anyone admitted, made a choice. She didn't run. She didn't dismiss him. She sat with him through the night, and together they remembered. Not everything, just fragments. The smell of oranges in a garden, a promise made under stars, the weight of his hand in hers as the world ended. By dawn, they knew 3 things with certainty. 1, they had lived before. 2, they had loved before. 3, they had found each other again. Eleanor never returned to Vermont. She and Thomas left together, 2 souls who had spent lifetimes searching, finally home. Her stepmother called it a scandal, running off with a disturbed stranger. Her stepsisters called it pathetic, clinging to a man's delusions. But on quiet nights, when Thomas holds Eleanor close and whispers her name, both names, the one she wears now and the one she wore then, she knows the truth that her family could never understand. Some loves are too vast for a single lifetime. Some promises too sacred for death to break. And sometimes, the girl they called plain and sent away returns as someone magnificent. Not because she changed her face, but because she finally remembered who she had always been. The ring sits on her finger now, its inscription worn smooth by 800 years of waiting. She doesn't need to read it anymore. She knows what it says. Amor vincit omnia. Even this, even death, even time.